Evelyn Beaumont wasn't just a housekeeper. She was the only daughter of the late Richard Beaumont, the man who had built one of the most successful luxury brands in the world. Then, why she was acting like a poor. A ruthless billionaire humiliates his housekeeper for looking like a beggar, until she arrives at a gala in a Rolls Royce, revealing a shocking secret that leaves him speechless. But by the time he realizes his mistake, it may already be too late. But before we start the video, let us know where you're watching this video, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe Story Store. And please share your thoughts about this story in comment section. The air in the grand ballroom shimmered with opulence, the chandeliers casting a golden glow over the sea of elite guests. Conversations hummed in the background, punctuated by the clinking of champagne glasses, until the moment the entrance doors swung open. Silence fell like a crashing wave. Every gaze snapped toward the woman who had just stepped in. She was breathtaking. Draped in a gown that flowed like molten gold, she radiated an effortless grace that commanded attention. Diamonds gleamed at her ears and wrists, but it was her presence, poised, confident, untouchable, that sent whispers rippling through the room. Julian Harrington, one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, had just taken a sip of his scotch when his world tilted. His grip tightened around the glass, breath hitching as he stared at her. Number? It couldn't be. His mind rebelled against the truth, but there was no mistaking those eyes, that delicate yet familiar face. He had seen her before, only she hadn't been draped in wealth. Just days ago, she had been wearing a simple uniform, dusting the shelves of his study like a servant. Evelyn. Julian's blood turned to ice. The woman he had dismissed as a mere housekeeper now stood before him, outshining every heiress in the room. How was this possible? And, more terrifyingly, what else had he been blind to? Somewhere in the crowd a hushed voice murmured her name. Evelyn Beaumont, the sole heir to the Beaumont Empire. Julian's stomach dropped. 3 days ago, he had thrown careless words at a woman he thought was beneath him. Now, that same woman had just stolen the breath from every man in the room, including his own. 3 days earlier, the storm inside Julian Harrington had been building all morning, dark and volatile. His business deal, a billion-dollar acquisition, was teetering on the edge of disaster. His board was pressuring him for answers, and his patience was razor-thin. The last thing he needed was incompetence from his staff. Storming into his study, he barely registered the presence of a woman dusting the bookshelves. The rhythmic strokes of her duster scratched at his nerves. When he finally looked up, his frustration ignited into something sharp and cruel. She looked unkempt. Her uniform slightly wrinkled, her dark hair pinned up haphazardly, her shoes scuffed from years of wear. There was nothing striking about her, just another faceless worker in his mansion. His lip curled in distaste. "You look like you crawled out of a dumpster," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is Harrington Estate, not a shelter. Have some pride." The duster in her hand froze. For the first time, she turned to face him. Her eyes, rich, dark pools, locked onto his, and for a brief moment something flickered there. A quiet storm. But in the next instant, it was gone. "I'm sorry, sir," she murmured, dipping her head. Julian didn't care. He had already dismissed her from his mind, returning to the real crisis at hand. His words, just another careless remark thrown at a nameless employee. Had he known who she truly was, perhaps he would have looked closer. Perhaps he would have noticed the quiet steel beneath her humility. Perhaps he would have seen that, in that moment, Evelyn wasn't just apologizing, she was memorizing. And 3 days later, Julian Harrington would learn a lesson he would never forget. The world had once whispered Evelyn Beaumont's name with reverence. The heiress to the Beaumont fortune, daughter of Richard Beaumont. The visionary behind one of the most successful luxury brands in the world. She had grown up in grand estates, walked red carpets, and dined with the elite. But when her father died, everything changed. Evelyn had vanished. The press speculated wildly. Some claimed she had gone into hiding. Others whispered that she had been exiled by greedy relatives. But no one knew the truth. Evelyn had walked away from wealth by choice. She had seen too many people bow before money, had watched so-called friends treat others as disposable if they weren't dressed in designer labels. So, she decided to strip away her name and privilege to understand the world outside of crystal chandeliers and silk-lined invitations. And so, Evelyn became Eve, a housekeeper. She had worked in hotels, estates, places where the wealthy barely acknowledged the staff that catered to their every whim. She had wanted to see people for who they truly were, without the illusion of status. Then she had met him. Julian Harrington. She had heard of him before. His name was synonymous with power, dominance in business, and an unshakable ego. She had expected arrogance from him, but not cruelty. His words that day had stung. Not because they mattered, but because they revealed the truth about him. He judged based on appearances. He valued people only for their worth in his world, and he had failed her test spectacularly. But fate had its own sense of irony. The night of the gala, Evelyn would step out of the shadows of anonymity and into the spotlight once more, and Julian would be left questioning everything he thought he knew. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, turning the invitation over in her hands. The Harrington Gala, the most prestigious event of the season. An evening where only the most powerful, the most influential, and the most untouchable gathered. And her name was on the guest list. She had intended to live a quiet life, to keep her identity buried. But after Julian Harrington's insult, something inside her had shifted. She hadn't planned to teach him a lesson. But now she couldn't resist. She smirked as she traced the embossed lettering on the card. If Julian had dismissed her so easily before, let's see if he could ignore her now. Rising to her feet, she picked up her phone and made a single call. "I need a dress," she said simply. The voice on the other end, a personal designer who had been waiting years for her return, practically squealed. "I knew this day would come. Gold, you need to wear gold." Evelyn chuckled. Yes, gold. Something that Julian Harrington would never be able to ignore. The day of the gala had arrived. Evelyn stood before the mirror, unrecognizable even to herself. Her gown, custom-made by one of the most sought-after designers in the world, clung to her like liquid gold, cascading over her body in a way that made her look like a queen returning to claim her throne. Diamonds adorned her ears and wrists, glittering under the warm lighting like tiny stars caught in her orbit. But it wasn't the dress or the jewelry that made the transformation complete. It was the fire in her eyes. For years, she had hidden behind plain clothes and quiet steps, choosing invisibility over spectacle. But tonight she wanted to be seen. She wanted Julian to look at her and realize exactly who he had underestimated. The door to the suite opened, and her longtime friend and personal assistant Celeste gasped. "Good God, Evelyn, you look devastating." Evelyn smirked. "Good, that's the goal." A sleek black Rolls Royce awaited her at the entrance of the hotel, the chauffeur already holding the door open. As she stepped inside, she let out a slow breath. No turning back now. As the car pulled up to the grand Harrington estate, she could already see the flashes of cameras, hear the distant murmurs of socialites exchanging gossip. The moment the valet opened her door, the world stilled. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Eyes widened in shock and recognition. Because after years of speculation, Evelyn Beaumont was back, and Julian Harrington had no idea what was about to hit him. Julian stood near the bar, whiskey in hand, bored out of his mind. These events were all the same: powerful men discussing business deals, women draped in expensive fabric hoping to catch his eye. Nothing ever surprised him. Until now. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Heads turned toward the entrance, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Julian glanced up, ready to dismiss whatever nonsense had captured their attention, and froze. His grip tightened around his glass as his world shifted on its axis. There, standing at the entrance like a vision crafted to torment him, was her. Evelyn. But not the Evelyn he had mocked. Not the woman in a wrinkled uniform and worn-out shoes. This Evelyn was breathtaking, powerful, untouchable. Her golden gown shimmered under the chandeliers, clinging to her curves in a way that made every man in the room take notice. She moved with an air of effortless confidence, her lips curved into a knowing smirk, as if she had orchestrated this very moment. The murmurs grew louder. That's Evelyn Beaumont. The Beaumont heiress? Julian's chest tightened. Heiress? The name sent a shockwave through his mind. Evelyn Beaumont. The same heiress who had once been the darling of the elite, who had disappeared after her father's death. The woman he had insulted without a second thought. His stomach twisted as the weight of his mistake came crashing down. He had dismissed her, treated her as nothing, and now she stood before him, effortlessly proving just how wrong he had been. Evelyn's gaze swept over the room, finally landing on him. She knew exactly what he was thinking, exactly how stunned he was. And as she took a step forward, Julian realized something with a chilling certainty. This night was only the beginning. Julian's pulse thundered in his ears as Evelyn approached. The confidence in her stride was lethal. Each step a reminder that she was no longer the woman he had once dismissed. The whispers intensified. Every guest was watching. Before he could summon the words to break the tension, a smooth voice cut through the air. Miss Beaumont. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward. Daniel Sinclair, one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. A man Julian considered a rival. Daniel extended his hand, his sharp blue eyes glinting with amusement. He knew exactly what he was doing. Shall we? Julian's jaw tightened as Evelyn turned to face Daniel, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate smile, she placed her hand in his. The ballroom collectively inhaled as Daniel led her onto the dance floor. The orchestra swelled, the violin singing as they moved in perfect harmony. Effortless, elegant, mesmerizing. Julian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had never seen her dance before, but now, as she twirled with Daniel, he hated that someone else was the one holding her. Julian. A voice snapped him out of his trance. His sister, Claire, stood beside him, arms crossed. You look like you want to murder someone, she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, Julian Harrington felt like he was losing. And worse, he wasn't sure if he had ever even been in the game. As the dance ended, Daniel leaned in and murmured something into Evelyn's ear, making her laugh softly. Julian felt it like a blade to the chest. He had to do something. Now Julian moved before he could think. As Evelyn turned to leave the dance floor, he stepped into her path. Evelyn. She stopped, tilting her head. There was no warmth in her eyes, no recognition of the man who once commanded her presence. only a polite indifference. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted, her voice smooth as silk. His throat tightened. Mr. Harrington, not Julian, not even a flicker of familiarity. He had reduced himself to a stranger in her world. He struggled to find the words. "I didn't know who you were." She arched a delicate brow. "No, you didn't." The weight of his own arrogance crushed him. He had been blind, cruel, and now it was too late. Julian opened his mouth to apologize, to say something, anything, but before he could, Daniel's voice cut in. "Ready to go?" Julian turned. Daniel stood beside her, watching him with an expression that was far too amused. Mocking. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, I believe I've seen everything I needed to tonight." Her words sliced through him. Julian took a step forward, desperate. "Evelyn, wait," but she had already turned away. And as he watched her walk out of his life, hand in hand with another man, Julian realized the truth. He had lost her before he ever had a chance. Julian stood frozen, watching as Evelyn disappeared into the crowd, her arm looped through Daniel's. The world around him felt muffled, as if the lavish ballroom had dimmed, leaving only the sharp sting of his own failure. He had to fix this. Without hesitation, he moved after her, weaving through the elegantly dressed guests. He had always been a man who commanded attention, who never needed to chase, but this was different. This time, he was the one left behind. "Evelyn, wait!" His voice rang out, stopping her just as she reached the grand staircase. She turned slowly, her gaze unreadable, her expression composed, as if nothing could rattle her. He had never been more afraid of silence. Julian inhaled sharply. "I was wrong," he admitted, forcing the words out. "About you, about everything." A flicker of amusement danced in her eyes, but it was fleeting. "That much is obvious," she said coolly. "You have every right to be furious," he continued, ignoring the whispers around them. "But I need you to know that I regret how I treated you. If I had known—" her head tilted. "If you had known I was wealthy, you would have treated me with respect?" The question landed like a punch to his gut. "No," he said quickly. "I mean, yes, but that's not the point. I was arrogant, judgmental, and I see that now." Evelyn exhaled, studying him for a long moment. "I appreciate your apology, Julian." Hope flickered in his chest until she spoke again. "But forgiveness doesn't erase the past." She offered a polite nod, then turned, descending the staircase with Daniel at her side. Julian remained motionless, the weight of her words settling deep. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. Tonight, Evelyn Beaumont had proven him wrong. Outside, the night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. Evelyn moved gracefully toward the valet station, Daniel beside her, speaking in hushed tones. Julian followed, unable to stop himself. He had spent years in control, dictating the outcomes of every situation. But tonight, he had no power. "Evelyn," he called out again, desperation creeping into his voice. She paused, but didn't turn around. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that," he said, stepping closer. "But I don't want to be the man who judged you by appearances. I want to be better." This time, she did turn. Her gaze was softer, but not swayed. "That's good, Julian," she said simply. "I hope you do become better." A sleek Rolls-Royce pulled up, its presence commanding. The valet opened the door, bowing slightly as Evelyn prepared to step inside. Julian's chest tightened. "If I had treated you differently," he asked, voice hoarse, "would there have been a chance?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers resting lightly on the car door. Then, with a sad smile, she answered, "Perhaps." It wasn't the closure he wanted, but it was the truth he needed. She slipped into the car, and as it glided away into the night, Julian stood alone under the golden glow of the streetlights. She was gone, and for the first time in his life, Julian Harrington realized that money couldn't buy back what he had lost.